Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, What's Next in Women's Health, the Biggest Innovation Opportunities for 2022. My name is Becky Johnson. I'm the Conference Director here at LSX, and it gives me great pleasure to host this webinar alongside our partners, Sygentia Innovation, running as part of LSX Femtech Leaders 11th to 15th of October. We have a portion of our own network here joining us today, but also a large number of new people to us. So very briefly, I wanted to introduce LSX. LSX stands for Life Science Executives. We're a community and network of senior life science decision makers across biotech, medtech, and health tech businesses, pharma companies, investors in the healthcare space, as well as payers and providers and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. We work to connect our network through digital content, such as today's webinar, digital reports and executive insight, digital roundtables and other formats, and through a program of high-level, large-scale conferences, networking, partnering events, and showcases. Whilst everyone is in the process of getting back to physical events, we're pleased to continue to be able to connect people and share the expertise of our community through digital formats such as this. We're absolutely delighted to be working with Sygentia Innovation, who are a global science, product, and technology development company partnering with clients in the medical, consumer, industrial, and food beverage sectors. It enables companies to understand the technology and market landscape, decide their future strategies, and solve complex science and technology challenges in order to deliver commercially successful products. Our fantastic speaker for today is Erica Cantor, Head of Women's Health at Sygentia. Her mission is to help companies design breakthrough solutions that will change the future of healthcare, and is particularly passionate about improving patient outcomes through holistic, user-centric design across the full spectrum of women's health. I'd like to ensure we allow a further minute or so for any latecomers to join before I hand over to Erica to kick us off today. So a couple of brief points to mention. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that you may have. So please ask your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll look to answer as many as I can. If you see a question you had in the Q&A already, you can upvote for that question to show you're also interested in the answer. Please do use the Q&A question for any questions rather than the chat function. I want to make sure I get to as many as I can. So that's quite enough from me. I know none of you are here today to listen to me speak. So without further ado, Erica, it's over to you.
Thanks, Becky. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Erica Cantor. I'm Head of Women's Health at Sygentia Innovation. I'll just share my screen with you now so you can see what we'll be talking about. So today's topic is very much the big future opportunities in women's health, looking at 2022 and beyond. This is me, and we'll be really looking at how the women's health landscape is evolving. It's changed quite drastically in the last couple of decades and will continue to change. Looking at some of those big opportunities, but also looking at what the keys are to developing commercially successful women's health solutions. So I'll spend about 5 minutes introducing Sygentia Innovation, about 45 minutes or so talking through a number of exciting areas, and hopefully there'll be about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. Quite a lot of content to rattle through, so I'm looking forward to discussing with you as we get into the questions. So just briefly, Sygentia Innovation is a leading provider in science-led advisory and product development services. We're part of the science group, and we work across market sectors in medical, consumer, industrial, and food and beverage. We have about 400 employees worldwide. Here in Cambridge, UK, we have our R&D center with about 180 engineers, scientists, PhD students, which help us to support our clients across a full range of services, from early R&D strategy, looking at developing action-oriented R&D roadmaps and the impact on your business, new market opportunities, through more tactical innovation consultancy, so helping to validate your right to play and win in new market spaces and creating new user experiences. Science deep dive is where we differentiate quite a bit. So this is where our scientists and mathematicians and clever PhD students and problem solvers come into play to help deliver technology IP that meet your stakeholder needs and different market applications. And we also do full product and service development from early concepts through to small scale manufacture. In the women's health space, we've been working for a couple of decades now. And these are just a few of the examples in the product development space that we've helped our clients with in the last 12 years or so. Everything from novel drug device combination product for HPV treatment, bioinformatics for non-invasive prenatal testing, novel incontinence solutions, a full range of really exciting products. And our goal really is to be part of the evolving conversation. I think one of the things that comes up again and again when talking about women's health is the need for better education and awareness around the challenges that women face, the unmet needs in the space, and what we can do to address these with novel solutions. And so our goal really is just to be part of that conversation, part of that community, and helping to push the agenda forward. So we've come up with a number of white papers. We're helping support some of these great events like LSX through webinars and engagement with the conferences themselves, as well as sort of blogs and podcasts to engage with the community on some of the more particular topics like menopause and period care. And so we're excited to be continuing the conversation with you today. So women's health, I think it means different things to different people. And so I thought it'd be good to start with how we define the space and the areas of focus. So women's health is really about the preservation of wellness and prevention of illness in women. And it's looking at the conditions that are unique to women, and these tend to be conditions specific to our reproductive anatomy, for instance, endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, the conditions that women specifically deal with. There are also conditions that are more common in women. Men can experience breast cancer, for instance, but it is more common in women. And there are chronic conditions that, like arthritis and asthma, that are also more common in women and therefore might benefit from bespoke solutions for that population. And there's also conditions that are just biologically different in women. So cardiovascular disease is an interesting one, as we're developing more research around the sex-specific differences in terms of how cardiovascular disease presents in men and women. We're starting to realize there is a huge discrepancy in symptoms and how it can be diagnosed. And so we're building our awareness of how different conditions present and behave in different populations. And it's important that our solutions are tailored to these populations. Women's health also changes quite a bit through our lifetime. And so at different stages, we have different needs and different exciting opportunities and challenges that we might face. And so I think for companies to really be successful, it's important to engage with women at each of these stages and build that trust with women over time and through their lifetime by providing solutions to those unique needs. And so, often there's ends of the spectrum that are forgotten. And so there's a need for this holistic care throughout life. So, why have we come here today to talk about women's health? It's really because there has been a lack of solutions. I think we can all recognize that, and that a lot of that comes down to the lack of female representation in clinical trials. There were nearly 20 years between 1977 and 1993 when the FDA guidance actually banned women of childbearing potential from participation in early phase clinical trials. And so this foundational clinical data is largely based on male physiology. And this is true even today in animal studies and cellular studies. Male physiology is the basis. And it's not necessarily due to any sort of malicious intent. It's often through simplicity of running trials or cost considerations. But the result is that we don't have that good understanding of how different conditions present in our different populations. And this extends beyond sex. It affects different demographics as well. So age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And we need better diversity in our trials to ensure that we're tailoring solutions for the entire population. And not only that, but when we do run trials with a diverse population, the analysis needs to be specific as well. So sex-specific analysis helps us to determine the differences in disease risk and symptoms, diagnostic sensitivity, and response to therapy. And so, as time has gone on, luckily the CDC and the FDA have recognized the need for this focus on women's health and on sex-specific data, and are starting to encourage it more and more in our trials. So we're gathering better data and we're getting there, but we've certainly been behind the curve. So where are we going to be focusing today? We have a lot to cover, and there's a lot that I'm excited to talk with you about. There are sort of 5 areas that we're going to be highlighting today, and that includes Femtech, at-home diagnostics, sexual health and well-being, in vitro fertilization, and breast health, specifically breast cancer screening. So these will be our topics, and we'll be rattling through some of the exciting areas for innovation in each of these. So Femtech is an emerging space. There's some controversy around the use of the term Femtech, but I think it captures this real catalyzing space with emerging startups and increasing funding from VCs and fantastic new solutions meeting unmet needs in women's health. A lot of the solutions have largely fit in that consumer health space, and we're seeing a lot of movement here. So here are some of the macro trends and drivers that we're noticing in the Femtech market. Sustainability is a clear one, and it's one that spans industries, not just women's health. Governments, corporations, and consumers are increasingly pushing for transparency and green products and sustainable solutions. And so there's a need to take that view, particularly when designing new products, and not include it as an afterthought. Awareness, again, back to that education. I think one of the brilliant things that the Femtech market has done is starting to build that awareness, not just for consumers, but for VCs, for investors, for medical professionals, to start to tackle those stigmas that have existed in women's health and open up the conversations about the benefits of these novel solutions. Enabling technologies are allowing us to address these gaps in creative ways. I think things like telehealth in particular, we've seen a huge increase in the last year and a half with the global pandemic, and that's definitely accelerated the application of some of these exciting innovations. There's increased investment. In 2020, investment in women's health reached an all-time high of $1.7 billion in funding that was raised across 240 deals, which is amazing to see. And some of the other drivers that we're seeing are the aging female population. This is a theme we'll come back to throughout the presentation, but the number of people aged 65 and older is projected to reach 1.5 billion in 2050. And more than half of those will be women who have unique health challenges, such as chronic diseases. As we know, there are some like arthritis and asthma and osteoporosis that present more commonly in women. And in the US, 90% of the 3.8 trillion in annual healthcare expenditure was on chronic and mental health conditions. And so there's a great need for innovation here, for supporting our different populations as they age and as they manage these illnesses. And so as you're starting to think about what that next product will be, what the next innovation will be in Femtech, what are some of the challenges and things to be aware of as you're looking for the new solutions? And I think, again, a theme we'll come back to is ensuring diversity by design. And that really starts with a thorough understanding of the challenges that are faced by women of diverse ages, races, cultures, sexual orientations, and how they will adopt and engage with new solutions. And so that understanding needs to be the basis for any new innovation, and allows the development of these personalized products that are grounded in science, grounded in the data. And that's where we need to start. We've seen a few interesting examples of startups that have failed, often because they've had a technology looking for a need. And that's the wrong way around to approach, particularly this market. There are so many unmet needs, and starting with that understanding allows new companies and startups to differentiate. The regulatory pathway is a really interesting one, particularly in this space. We've seen consumer companies starting to look to move into the medically regulated space, which is a huge hurdle to jump. And we've also seen the bigger medtech companies looking to become more consumer-facing, consumer-centric, which is, again, a change in thinking, a change in business model. And so the implications of your regulatory pathway need to be considered right from the get-go, because they have a knock-on effect on your development timelines, on your commercial strategy, on your competition. And so you need to very much be considering that end use and your intended market to ensure you have a clear strategy and plan. And finally, the lack of clinical evidence. I think we've all heard the horror stories and the products that haven't been developed in the right way. And, there were hundreds of period tracking apps, for instance, that were all based on a standard 28-day cycle, and therefore were inaccurate for the majority of the population. And so the best way and easiest way to quickly build trust with not only consumers, but patients, healthcare professionals, caregivers, is to have that robust clinical data. And that also allows you to provide those actionable and accurate insights to all stakeholders and provide real value for your entire network. So what are some of the future opportunities? Where should you focus next? Of course, I think highlighting chronic conditions is absolutely critical. A lot of the solutions that have been successful that we've seen in Femtech have focused on reproductive health, of course. It's a big space. Fertility is something that VCs can understand, whether they're male or female. But the need for bespoke solutions in the chronic condition space is growing. And some of the more specific areas that we're quite excited about include dysmenorrhea, so period pain. About 80% of women experience period pain. Mental health is, of course, a growing space, and there's a need for better innovations to support women throughout their lifetimes. 1 in 5 women experience mental health conditions. Heart disease, not only does it present differently in women, but it's also the leading cause of death for women. And so we need to better understand how it presents and affects women's health. And menopause, nearly every woman in the world will undergo menopause, and 75% of women will experience hot flushes, which is only 1 of 35 potential symptoms. So what are some potential solutions? Could neurostimulation be used to treat period pain, perhaps? What about telemedicine for those 10% of women with postpartum depression that often get forgotten and often don't report their symptoms for fear of being a bad mom? I think there's a need for much more support postpartum, and telemedicine could be an interesting solution. Wearable tech is perfectly applicable to heart disease and helping us to prevent and predict heart disease in women and start to gather some of that data that's been missing. And for menopause, hormone replacement therapy isn't suitable for all women. And so could nutritional supplements or non-invasive digital tools be used to help ease some of the symptoms of menopause? Perhaps. But all really exciting areas in the Femtech space that I'm hoping to see new solutions in the coming years. So moving on to at-home diagnostics. So taking a patient-centric approach to diagnostics. It's a really interesting space and very much an overlap between a number of different markets. The over-the-counter test market, wearables, women's health, all combine into this at-home diagnostic space. And it follows a continuum from quite simplistic online surveys through to smartphone apps, wearables that gather data, at-home tests that give you instant results like pregnancy tests, at-home sample collection and remote analysis, and telemedicine. And so there's a whole range of different business models, different approaches to the at-home testing market. And it's a market that's changing quite significantly. So particularly with the COVID pandemic, there's an increased familiarity with at-home testing, and also an increased pressure on our healthcare systems and a need for better management of conditions at home. And again, the aging female population is only going to increase this demand and pressure. Some of the constraints and challenges with at-home testing include things like the possibility of user error. Whenever you're asking a person at home to gather a sample, there's a chance that they won't do it correctly. And so there's a need for well thought through human factors and user centricity to design these types of products, particularly when there isn't a healthcare professional in the loop to analyze the results. And lack of adherence. If it's a difficult thing to do, like if you need to gather blood, for instance, then you won't always get patients who adhere as often as they should to the regimen. So lots of really interesting challenges. And for the, I won't spend too much time here, is the big slide, but for the women over 40 population, for the aging population, there are so many potential conditions that could benefit from something like at-home testing for better management and monitoring, everything from oral health to dermatology to cardiovascular health. And it's quite an expansive space. And this just gives you a flavor of the different spaces that could be explored. And to give one example, we had a look at the heart health space in particular and some of the different solutions that are out there. So the NHS have an online survey that compares your heart age to your real age, which is one application. There's a smartphone app, Azumio, which actually measures your heart rate instantly through your phone camera, so you don't even need any peripheral devices. There's wearables. We all know the Apple Watch is measuring things like heart rate, but Oura have a ring that measures a variety of biomarkers in your sleep through advanced sensor technology, including heart rate variability. At-home tests, we're all familiar with ovulation tests and pregnancy tests. Selfcheck also have a rapid at-home test for cholesterol, which uses a small finger prick blood sample, and you get results in about 5 minutes. The more comprehensive version of that is Everlywell's at-home sample collection kit, which is then sent into a lab for a detailed report on a panel of heart health markers. And finally, telemedicine. So Genève have a telehealth service that covers the full perimenopause journey, but also include general health and wellness offerings and heart health services as well. So this gives you a sort of flavor for the range of types of products you might see in the at-home testing space. All right, next section, sexual health and wellness, perhaps one of the most taboo of subjects in the women's health space, but is also one of the most rapidly changing spaces recently. And it's been exciting to see some of the emerging trends that are affecting this market. Some of these are going to look familiar and are similar across the femtech and women's health space in general. Sustainability and natural ingredients are big drivers. Technology is allowing us to connect with ourselves and others in new ways. But there's also that increased education and awareness that we're seeing here as well. And that's through body positive advocates and startups and the Gen Z generation that are starting to tackle these stigmas that are associated with sexual health and wellness, normalizing the conversations around sex. Sexual inclusivity is one of the big drivers here. Much of the offerings in sexual health and wellness space have been very heteronormative, and we're starting to see a break in that. And so new solutions that are addressing the needs of the diverse population. So the LGBTQ plus community, people with disabilities, the aging population, all deserve pleasure as well. And we're seeing some great solutions starting to emerge. And there's also been a rise in intimacy and self-care, especially with the pandemic. Self-care has become a necessity, not just a luxury. People are connecting with themselves through meditation, through yoga, through journaling, and through masturbation. And these are all part of our holistic care for ourselves and for each other. So a few interesting examples. So just looking here at the self-care and intimacy space in particular, a lot of the emerging technologies that we're seeing are app-based. And so Dipsy, for instance, is a sexual wellness app that have short audio stories that are designed to help women get aroused. Of course, women and men are aroused in very different ways, and this taps into that imagination. Coral is an app specifically for couples designed to destigmatize some of those conversations around sex and encourage intimacy and sharing. And Rosie is a tech platform tailored specifically for women with low sex drive and providing that holistic approach to sexual health and wellness. And looking at the inclusivity space, there are a few great companies here as well. So Mode are a gender neutral, inclusive sexual wellness brand who create products that you wouldn't be ashamed to have on your nightstand, focusing on body safe essentials and really simplifying and normalizing sex through these types of products. Handy is addressing the need for sex toys for the disabled community. And have developed the world's first hands-free sex toy designed for people with hand limitations, which I think is amazing. And Taboo is addressing the lack of information and products that are available for menopausal women. Of course, sex drive does not stop with menopause, but there are new challenges like vaginal dryness, which can be a symptom of menopause. And so there's a great need for products to address that particular part of the population. So that's the sexual health and wellness market. And now we're going to move into fertility and in vitro fertilization, which is, I think, a very exciting space. There's a lot of activity happening here, and we've done quite a bit of research into where the opportunities lie. So having a look first at some of the causes of infertility. Infertility is often seen as a female condition, but of course it affects both men and women. So a third of the cases of infertility are caused by female factor infertility, a third by male factor infertility, and a third of the cases are either both partners or unexplained. And this can be one of the most distressing times for couples to discover that they can't conceive naturally. There can be a huge number of underlying causes. Age tends to be the most common, but there are a number of other factors that can influence your likelihood of conceiving naturally. And so this is a growing space. I think a lot of the investment we've seen in women's health has been in reproductive health and fertility. It's definitely a space that more of the VC community understand, more men understand, the fertility space, and so are more willing to invest. But there are still a huge number of unmet needs here that can be addressed. So having a quick look at some examples. So in the early stages of conception, of course, the key is identifying that fertile window. There's a huge number of new solutions out there to help with identifying this window at home. There's the classic pee on a stick ovulation tests that you can do at home. There's new digital solutions and wearables as well. So AVA have a clinically proven ovulation tracking wearable that you wear at night and monitors a number of biomarkers to help you identify that fertile window. And Mira have an at-home AI-powered ovulation test for luteinizing hormone. For those couples that can't conceive naturally, either because they have infertility or because they're a same-sex couple or a single mom who'd like to conceive, then assisted reproduction is the way to go. And there's a huge range of interesting technologies here, and we'll go into more depth in the coming slides. But some of the exciting ones are things like time-lapse, using deep learning for sperm selection. It's a very exciting space in the lab innovation area. Moving into pregnancy, we're starting to see more interesting solutions for monitoring pregnancy and gathering data around pregnancy to support women through this part of the journey. Bloom Life is an interesting example of a company that has started very much in the consumer space and gathering data through their clinically validated contraction monitor, and are now looking to move into the clinically regulated space and developing solutions for fetal monitoring and monitoring for preterm labor. And a lot of that is through the data that they've collected to date from consumers. So a great example of a company that's in transition. And Urgene Health have an advanced non-invasive prenatal test that allows for testing with a reduced risk of miscarriage. And of course, we're seeing a huge number of new solutions, new tech for new mums. LV is a company that I've kept my eye on for a while now, and they've been growing rapidly, a lot through that education and awareness side, advocacy for women's health. And they have a brilliant wearable silent connected breast pump. They're moving into the reimbursement space in the States with their newest product. Atlantic Therapeutics, again, a brilliant company that's addressing stress urinary incontinence, both for women postpartum, but also women later in life. And they have a non-invasive pelvic floor exerciser. The pelvic floor is a really challenging muscle to access and train yourself. And this is basically a pair of cycling shorts that does it for you, which is fantastic. So for those women, for those couples that do need to seek medically assisted reproduction, what are some of the key considerations? It's quite a daunting path to go down when you've realized you can't conceive naturally for whatever the reason, and you decide to pursue something like IVF. There are a huge number of questions that you might have, and all of them are complicated. So cost is, of course, a key factor, and this varies widely from country to country and from clinic to clinic. And some of the influencing factors can be the type of treatment, so whether you need intrauterine insemination or in vitro fertilization, whether you have insurance coverage, what number of cycles you might need to go through in order to conceive. And so with IVF only being 25 to 30% successful, it's likely you'll need to go through multiple cycles. And that needs to be taken into account when you're considering the cost of treatment. Success rates also vary widely and are reported in different ways by different clinics. So some will report success per oocyte retrieval, per cycle, per embryo transfer, and report success against implantation rates, clinical pregnancy rates, or live birth rates. And all of this can be very confusing in terms of how you compare different IVF clinics. And there's no clear regulation or standardization around this success reporting. And of course, patient-specific factors like age tend to actually be the most impactful factors when considering success. And finally, access. There are just broad global inequalities in the access to fertility treatment. Even in developed countries like the US, there are limitations around affordability. And again, that comes down to income and insurance coverage. There's a stigma, so there's a lack of awareness and education, particularly for minority groups. And there's also restrictive policies. And so for single people and same-sex couples, for instance, some insurance coverages need you to prove that you have an infertility diagnosis. And so for those seeking treatment who don't have that, it can be quite restrictive, and they can't access the same care that the rest of the population can receive. And so there are a huge number of considerations and challenges for people who are seeking treatment. And the journey itself can be quite complex when you actually start. And so the patient process tends to start with a consultation with the doctor, a number of tests, monitoring, blood samples, ultrasound, before a trigger injection and egg retrieval. And then you move into the clinical process. And this is the process that happens in the IVF lab, typically by an embryologist. And now this shows 6 steps here, but in reality, there are something like 80 different steps that an embryologist will go through to develop an embryo. And it's very complicated and managed right down to the environmental conditions in the lab in order to optimize outcomes. So quite a well-controlled and complicated process. And then it's back into the patient process beyond that, ideally through to successful pregnancy test and antenatal care. And now, of course, it shows it being quite linear, and in reality, you tend to go through cycles through this. So if the fertilization step, for instance, isn't successful, you may need to go back around the loop, and that might happen at various stages. There are also a number of optional steps in the process. So if there are excess embryos at the end, then you might choose to have them frozen or vitrified and stored for your next cycle or your next child. If you need to go through a quality assessment of the embryo, for instance, you might choose to do pre-implantation genetic testing. So there's lots of interesting add-ons and alterations to this process to improve outcomes. But the areas that we're most excited about, where we think there are opportunities for innovation, are the embryo quality assessment space. So it's one of the biggest, or one of the most important steps, I suppose, during IVF in selecting the best embryo for implantation, particularly if there are multiple viable embryos. And assessing the health of that embryo, it can be quite subjective, and can potentially introduce risk to the embryo as well. So in traditional processes, the embryo is removed from the incubator and inspected under a microscope. And so it undergoes that manual handling process that can risk damaging it. So new solutions like time-lapse imaging are really exciting because they allow for monitoring of the embryo in situ and also gathering longitudinal data about how that embryo is developing. And this can give us a much better picture of the viability of embryos. But of course, then we also have all that extra data, and the embryologist is busy. And so AI, of course, machine learning are being introduced to help analyze that data and give just the critical insights to the embryologist when they need them. So we're seeing great advancements in that space. Pre-implantation genetic testing is being used more and more and can help ensure that an embryo is free from possible chromosome abnormalities before implantation. But it can be expensive, and the biopsy process can also risk damaging the embryo. So new methods are being explored, like non-invasive PGT, which actually analyzes the cell-free DNA in spent culture media. So it'll be really exciting to see where this goes in the future. And finally, the vitrification or freezing and storage of embryos. This is becoming more common practice, not only for excess embryos during IVF, but also for fertility preservation, for example, for cancer patients before they go through cancer treatment. But it can be quite a challenging and time-consuming process to freeze the eggs without damaging them. And so quality control is needed, and particularly for when the eggs and embryos are in storage, to monitor their conditions and ensure they are healthy when they're needed. So new solutions like automation and digital sample tracking are being used to streamline this process. So what are some of the emerging challenges or the barriers to entry if you're considering developing a new IVF solution? So the first one is really ease of use and implementation. So in the same way that the unmet needs of consumers and patients need to be considered when developing new products, when you're designing a new piece of equipment for a lab, the needs of all stakeholders, particularly in this case, the embryologist, need to be fully understood. Their processes have been refined over years, and they understand them in depth and know what outcomes they can expect from their process. And so any new solution must consider that current practice and be designed to actually ease workload as opposed to introduce new complexity with something like data overload, for instance. The clinical efficacy must also be considered again in this case. It must be proven to improve clinical outcomes in order to be adopted, and also should help, particularly in this space, to standardize and optimize current lab processes and reduce some of that variability that we see between labs and between countries. And finally, of course, cost, particularly given the current lack of reimbursement in many countries. New solutions need to have a clear commercial value, not just for the clinic, of course, but also reducing cost for the patient. And this will ensure that new solutions are readily adopted. Moving into our final section, and then I'll get a chance to breathe. We're talking next about breast health, and particularly breast cancer. And so this is just shows quickly the global incidence of breast cancer in 2020 across both men and women. There were about 20 million new cases of cancer diagnosed in 2020, and 11.7% of those were breast cancer. Looking specifically at the female population, breast cancer represented nearly a quarter of new cases in 2020. And so there's still a huge need to better understand and better manage breast cancer. The care continuum is shown here. We'll be focused specifically on the screening part of this for this section, but of course, it's part of the whole continuum where there's emerging understanding and research into how lifestyle changes, for instance, can help prevent the risk of breast cancer, and emerging technologies in the diagnosis, treatment, and monitoring spaces as well. Some of the trends and drivers that we're seeing, aging population is here, of course, and driving up the number of cancer cases globally. Some emerging solutions and technologies include automation and AI as usual, but also genetic testing, which is driving change in this market. And we're also seeing an interesting trend towards the de-escalation of therapy and a better understanding of the risks of overdiagnosis and overtreatment, specifically of low risk or slow growing cancers, where actually the risk of treatment, the risk going through something like chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery are higher and harder on the body than the small, slow growing cancer is. And so a movement towards monitoring and tracking rather than moving straight to treatment. So quite a few different trends here. And looking quickly at the different breast cancer screening methods. So mammography is the standard of care in most countries. It's the most commonly practiced and widely used breast cancer screening modality. And it visualizes the breast tissue through X-rays. There's also breast self-exam and clinical breast exams. There's mixed research into how effective these are at identifying abnormalities, but have been shown to be useful as adjuncts for self-management of cancer between screenings. Ultrasound and MRI are often used as adjuncts to mammography, particularly for women with dense breast tissue where mammography is not as accurate. Digital mammography is an emerging technology that combines X-rays with thin cross-sectional images to develop 3D images of the breast tissue. And this was approved by the FDA in 2011, and is so becoming more and more used in the industry to improve the accuracy of our screening. And finally, gene detection. So women with mutations in the BRCA1 and 2 genes have a 50 to 80% risk of developing breast cancer. So there's an emerging need to improve the access to genetic testing in particular. For example, in the UK, it's only available if a relative has a positive test for a mutation. And so if this could be more widely applied, perhaps we could better identify populations at high risk. Each of these different methods comes with limitations, of course. Some of the limitations that we're seeing with mammography include still a high incidence of false negatives, so where the screening does not pick up a cancer that is there and introduces a risk to the patient, and false positives, where the screening picks up something and leads to further diagnostics and eventually discovering that there is no cancer there. And both are challenging and increase anxiety for the patient themselves and can increase the burden on the healthcare system. Mammography also introduces a risk of exposure to ionizing radiation, which is why this method often isn't used for screening, particularly in population level screenings, until women are 40 or 50 years old, because the risk of radiation doesn't outweigh the benefits of screening itself. And so that's a limitation. And of course, as mentioned, mammography tends to be less accurate for women with dense breast tissue. So what are some of the opportunities for innovation here? We've been doing some of our own research into this space and talking to women about their experience with screenings. One of the other limitations, of course, with mammography is the breast compression and how uncomfortable that can be. Often the pain and anxiety around having breast cancer screening puts women off. And so there's a need for better solutions there as well. And so, yes, as mentioned, mammography is the current standard of care and has a number of limitations. So could an alternative imaging technology be developed that could replace mammography, addressing some of these unmet needs around radiation exposure, accuracy, and discomfort? Perhaps. For the 40% of women with dense breast tissue, not only is mammography less accurate, but they also have a higher risk of developing breast cancer. And currently, the only way of measuring breast density is through a mammogram. And so at your first mammogram, you may or may not get a measurement of your breast density, and it is a subjective measurement. So you're given typically a score based on the visual inspection of the image by the radiologist. So instead, could a standalone technology be developed to measure breast density at the point of care, perhaps implemented for all women in their 20s, for instance, to allow for better management of their care and perhaps put them down a different care pathway where they're screened through MRI or ultrasound, which is better suited to dense breast tissue. population level screening programs tend to be one size fits all. This is partly because there are a large number of factors that influence your risk of developing breast cancer. Unlike lung cancer, for instance, where whether you smoke or not is a determining factor, for breast cancer, it can be your family history, your genetic mutations, your lifestyle factors, whether you've had a child or not. And so there's no systematic process currently to identify high or at-risk groups. So could an automated system be developed that could improve our risk stratification processes and better allocate our healthcare resources? And finally, screening programs often miss early and interval cancers. So mammography is not suited to the younger population due to that exposure to radiation. And so often early cancers in younger women are missed because screening doesn't start till you're 40 or 50. And sometimes cancers are missed between screenings. So if you only have your screening every 1, 2, or 3 years, there's a risk that cancer could develop during that time. So could an emerging test method be used to easily and regularly screen the population and develop a longitudinal view of your breast health? A few of the exciting ideas we have here include low field MRI as a replacement to mammography. Classic MRI machines are massive and take up multiple rooms in a hospital, typically because they're designed to scan the entire body. But emerging technologies are being developed to scan particular parts of the body, like the brain, for instance. And we think this could also be readily applied to breast cancer screening. Could a point of care microwave imaging or ultrasound-based solution be developed for breast density measurement, perhaps? Could this be a handheld system that your doctor uses in the doctor's office to easily quantify breast density? That could be an interesting solution to support the care continuum for women and determining the best care pathway for them. And of course, machine learning could be used for better risk stratification and patient management. The challenge here, as is the case in many applications, is accessing and managing the data. Electronic healthcare records are still quite cumbersome. Interoperability is still a challenge. And so while those are being solved, there's an opportunity in the future to apply machine learning for breast cancer risk stratification. And finally, liquid biopsy is an emerging space, and we think there are great applications here. One of the challenges with liquid biopsy and genetic testing is the need for large samples, large blood samples for testing, which puts a lot of people off. But of course, as women, we produce a fairly regular natural biopsy when we menstruate. So could there be an at-home menstrual blood collection device like a smart tampon or smart pad that could collect a sample to be sent into a lab for regular screening? That could be really interesting and then could allow for a longitudinal view of how genetic mutations are developing over time, and perhaps even allow us to identify cancers earlier than they could even be picked up on a mammogram. So a couple of final thoughts before we launch into questions. User-centric design, I think, is the key here. And so as we're considering developing some of these solutions for the women's health market, how do we ensure they're commercially viable? And while there are so many great opportunities in the short term, there's a huge opportunity simply to improve health outcomes and patient experience. Even at a very basic level, incremental change is massive. And so there's a need to really identify where solutions can have the biggest impact here. Optimizing and standardizing the delivery of care, whether it's through telemedicine, whether it's through better screening programs, will allow us to address the needs across broader populations. And we need to reduce costs and increase access to care. It's fantastic to have new technologies available, but if they're only available to people who can afford them, then they're not fulfilling their full potential. And so there's a need to address the challenges with reimbursement and to reduce the cost and access, improve access these types of great solutions. So we think that a very practical and user-centric approach is what's required. And we're excited to discuss how we can help you address the diverse and unique needs of women globally. So that's it from me. We might be down to just 5 minutes for questions because I rambled on a little bit, apologies. If you would like to continue the discussion, please feel free to get in touch directly, and I'll be at LSX Femtech Leaders in a couple of weeks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Erica. That was hugely informative. Absolute sort of whistle-stop tour over sort of what is a massive topic. We've got a couple of questions. Obviously, completely appreciate that everyone watching has different focuses, so some of them are slightly niche, but just to cover a couple of things. First of all, yes, the slides will be available to get afterwards, as well as the recording of the webinar. So Erica will make that link available, and we will send that round to everyone watching. So we've had a couple of questions about that. We also had a question regarding whether or not there were any VCs that were specifically investing in women's healthcare. 100% there are. I'm sure Erica will be able to sort of explain more, but Femtech Leaders, the event that obviously Sygentia and Erica are supporting, very much focuses around the investment and fundraising aspect of women's healthcare and Femtech. So if you haven't already, please do register for Femtech Leaders. It is free for Femtech companies to attend. So what I'll do is I will put a link into the chat that you'll see below. Don't go and register now, stay, listen to Erica. But after it's finished, please do register. We've got some fantastic companies that are speaking, several of which Erica mentioned, Ava, Atlantic Therapeutics, Bloom Life, Kind Body, sort of the list goes on, so do check that out. But first of all, Erica, so we've got, we're asking, Melissa is asking, what are the trends and where you should be looking around sort of menopause care? I think that'd be a webinar in itself.
100%, yeah.
But other than obviously those that you mentioned in the focus areas, maybe sort of give a, top three, and then just to give an overview.
Yeah, of course. So, menopause and perimenopause can span from quite an early age as well, from, sometimes 30s, but certainly 40s and beyond. And then the needs are vast. I think that education and understanding is a big one. And so companies like Genève, who are addressing that and helping women to understand what to expect when going through menopause, is huge. And just that education, helping women to know what's coming and plan for it, because it's not talked about enough. Hot flashes are a big space and a big topic, and different solutions for cooling, for instance, direct during the day or during the night, for night sweats is huge, because that can have a major impact. A lot of women are still in the workforce when they're starting to go through menopause. And so having discrete solutions that can allow them to manage their symptoms when they're in a meeting, for instance, or giving a talk, being able to manage the arising symptoms and continue with their day. I think that's a big space as well. Those are the ones I could think off the top of my head. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and again, do reach out to Erica, and I'm sure you can go into a sort of more detail. Christine says, I think what you're referring to here is the fact that you sort of didn't mention this, but she says testing for hair and eye color is sort of the next step, sort of on that sort of innovation journey. I mean, that was a question. I'm presuming that's what you mean, Christine. Is that where you see things are going? I think is what.
So I think that's an interesting one. I think what that's referring to is the genetic testing during IVF. At the moment, it's typically for diagnostic purposes and looking for predispositions and genetic conditions. It could be used for things like hair color, eye color, gender, or sex at the very least. And so, yeah, that's the conversation that's happening. I think the ethical concerns are massive, and that's a broader conversation at a government level about what's acceptable and what's not. And I won't get into the ethics of it, but it is possible, and it'll be interesting to see where that line is drawn and what it's used for.
Yeah. And Amy Shannon says, what about ovarian cancer? I'm presuming that's because obviously you only touched upon breast cancer. I mean, there are so many women's cancers. So that was sort of a question. I think I don't think Erica meant to purposely, there's only so much time.
There's only so much time, but definitely, I mean, there are, breast cancer is the one that gets the most attention. But there is a massive need for better understanding and better research into cervical, ovarian, vulvar, and all sorts of uterine cancers as well. And we just don't have enough data. We've seen great results with cervical cancer with screening programs and the HPV vaccine, and similar solutions are needed because they often go undetected. Ovarian cancer can be a major, it's a leading cause of death for women when it comes to cancer. And so, yes, I'd love to talk about it more.
I'll keep on saying, I mean, there are so many questions that are coming in that again, address very specific sort of areas within sort of women's health and Femtech. So I will say reach out to Erica separately. So, we'll get to them. But so you mentioned data, Erica. We've got a comment that's come into sort of the panelists that says we must have an ethical, philosophical discussion around it, i.e. data, exploitation of the wealth of data created by the wrong people for the wrong reasons. I mean, absolutely.
Yes.
Again, Christine, there is a data panel at Femtech Leaders. I hate to bang that drum, but we're trying to cover some of the sort of more gritty topics as well. Ashley, I think, or Ashley, apologies for the pronunciation. It says, you mentioned a lot of different solutions, but most address one portion of the market. Do you see a move towards holistic approaches that address many parts of health, or a continued deep solution for one aspect of health?
Very good question. I think both, I'm hoping, because some issues do require tailored, targeted solutions, and there's certainly a move towards personalized care and personalized treatment. And that's definitely needed in the women's health space, since we've been lacking in any kind of tailored solution whatsoever. But we are seeing companies not only build their portfolios around that more holistic care, so starting with an offering and building out to address parallel markets and needs, but also, especially in the space of telemedicine, we're seeing companies expand beyond one indication and really providing that holistic care. And I think that's where the real value add is, certainly.
Yeah, great. Well, Erica, thank you so much. And we'll have to leave it there. I mean, there is another anonymous question that's come through asking what's the next big innovation for urinary incontinence, which I mean, that is quite a question. So apologies that we can't get to that. But again, Erica and Sagentia, they are at Femtech Leaders. The platform allows you to reach out, set up a meeting with Sagentia, have these more sort of niche discussions that are obviously quite specific to your questions and concerns, which, that's the reason Femtech Leaders is designed to bring the Femtech community, women's health community together. We've got a load of discussions that will be live. The webinar, the slides will all be available. So I do encourage you, whether it's through Femtech Leaders or, whether it's LinkedIn, or just drop Erica an email to get in touch. It's been really, really fantastic. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone that has been able to join us. I hope that we'll get a chance to sort of speak and chat again very soon. But for the meantime, that's everything from me. And once again, thank you so much, Erica.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining and participating.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.